All right. So we are now live. Hi, everybody. I'm Carla with the Historic Chicago, or the Chicago Bungalow Association. Tonight, we'll be talking about flooding, doing an in-depth exploration of the causes of flooding on your property and what you can do inside and outside of your house to help reduce flooding and sewer backups. Just a couple of housekeeping things since we are recording this. A lot of you guys signed up for this. We had a huge number, over 400 of you signed up. So we're going to keep everybody muted while we're on here. Also, if you look down at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A section. So if something comes up that you want us to address at the end of Ryan's talk, put your questions in there. Don't put them in the chat. The chat is going to be reserved only for internal stuff if we need it, or to send you guys a link out or something. But check out, only use the Q&A, please. It's just another way with so many folks logging on tonight to keep track of things and to make sure we catch as much as we can. Let's see. We're gonna try and answer as many questions as we can. Ryan's gonna be talking somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour. And, we're going to push a little bit later. We said this was from 6 to 7. We can totally push to like 7:15. That's fine, just to get more, back to you guys. And also we're going to be recording all of this. So you will get a recording of it, so you don't have to frantically take notes on everything sent to you if you did sign up for the seminar. If you didn't actually sign up in advance and are just logging on now, you can, shoot us an email too, and we'll send that link your way. But you'll automatically get it, assuming you signed up too. All right, well, let's just get started, I think. I just want to introduce Ryan. This is Ryan Wilson, who's kind enough to join us tonight. Ryan has over 14 years of experience designing, building, and developing innovative solutions that increase the vitality of cities. He feels fortunate to be afforded this platform to blend his interests in public education, do-it-yourself home maintenance and repair, and nature-based solutions for urban flooding to empower bungalow homeowners and to improve their properties. He's a registered landscape architect in the state of Illinois and holds a BLA in landscape architecture from the University of Georgia. He lives in Chicago's South Side neighborhood of Hyde Park, where he enjoys much of what the region has to offer, especially Promontory Point, where I was just last weekend, Hyde Park Produce, and the Jackson Park Harbor. His preferred pronouns are he, him, and his. Without further ado, I think we will get going. I'm gonna shut my screen down and mute myself too, but I'll see you in a bit, Ryan. Thanks.
Thank you, Carla. And thank you to the Chicago Bungalow Association, as well as to all you members out there. I will say at the start of this conversation that usually it's a conversation. There's a lot of back and forth when we're in the same room together. And tonight, this virtual presentation is going to be a little bit different. So I do encourage you to use that Q&A function. We'll do our best to, behind the scenes, answer your questions and then answer those questions that are coming up at the end. So thanks to Carla for sorting those. And don't hesitate to put those questions in. We'll do our best to kind of consolidate as we move forward. So I'm going to share my screen in just a little bit, but first, I think that introduction is fairly accurate. I am a landscape architect. I have been working for quite a while on nature-based solutions and really dealing with the issue of too much water, or sometimes too little water. And that mostly relates to stormwater or floodwater in our region. And I have a particular stance, which is the use of nature-based solutions or green infrastructure is a really useful way to solve many of the smaller scale and some of the larger scale flood issues that cities like Chicago and many of the communities in our region experience. So I'll just go ahead and admit my bias from the start. I believe in green infrastructure. I believe in community-based solutions. And I also believe in low-cost DIY solutions. And that's one of the things I love about the Bungalow Association and this sort of presentation. So I've given this presentation a number of different times over the years, and while it's a disappointment not to see your faces, I hope we can overcome some of that distance with the Q&A. But before we get started, I want to make a couple caveats because I see that our numbers are rising, and I understand that this notice went out beyond our region. So we may be joined by people outside of Chicago, outside of Illinois. And if you were coming in from another part of the US or even further abroad, a couple caveats. First, we're going to be talking about flooding, specifically urban flooding. So the sort of flooding that's not necessarily tied to rivers or coastlines. So probably much of what you're going to hear is going to be applicable to areas in the Midwest, in the Northeast, in the South, Southeast, particularly though not areas that are related to kind of coastal flooding or places that get storm surge. It's also going to be hard to draw direct comparisons to some of the things that we experience in the Midwest that happen in the west of the Rockies. We have a different climate, a lot of different water issues and ground conditions. So just make a caveat, if you are calling in from another place, my expertise is in the Midwest and in Chicago specifically. I will try to answer your question, but it won't be prioritized. And if you do ask a question, we'll do our best to kind of respond afterwards. So again, we're talking about urban flooding, flooding in cities and urbanized areas, and excited to get started. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and we will go. Okay, so here we go, just adjusting right now. Okay, learning to use a new system, 1 more minute. Okay, so first of all, thank you, excited to be here. Tonight, we're going to go over a few different things. So first, we're going to focus on understanding the types of flooding and water damage that affect our typical homes in the region. And we're going to have a focus on residential properties. I'm going to talk more about bungalow style homes, but this is applicable to many of our older homes, our homes that are decades old, not necessarily built in the last 20 years or 30 years, but there are similarities. And so if you live in an old home, if you live in a bungalow, this is a great place. A lot of what you hear tonight would be applicable, but just know that this is, some of these things might not apply to your home type. The second thing we're going to focus on is trying to understand the risk and impact of flooding. So this is largely, I largely define this as understanding where the water comes from and maybe how it can hurt you, your property value, your own public health, your own personal health, or your family's health. And then the third thing we're going to dive into is more of a what can I do about it? And kind of going back to my intro, I'm really going to try to focus on those low cost or no cost solutions that are homeowner maintenance things. And some of them will sound very simple and practical. Some might sound a little more complex. We'll start with those kind of low or no cost fixes, and then for each recommendation, I'll try to suggest a couple more involved investments. And from there, we'll just kind of wrap and move into our Q&A. So let's get started. So urban flooding, many of you probably have experienced some form of flooding. If I could figure out how to use the survey feature on Zoom, I would have asked you to raise your hand. Who's experienced basement backup? Who's experienced water in your basement? Who's, oh, we got the hands, this is great. Who's experienced water flooding in your yard, in your streets? Who's experienced a flood at a neighborhood, a civic institution, a park, or a school? I'm seeing a lot of hands going up. So clearly we're here for a reason, and it's to probably understand flooding, why is it happening, and what we can do about it. So you're not alone. There are many properties in Chicago that are at risk of flooding, and I pulled out this quote from a recent research paper that suggested over 75,000 of Chicago's properties, that's not just in the region, but in the city of Chicago, are potentially at risk of flooding. And this is a fairly novel tool for understanding flood risk. But what I find interesting about it is that it's starting to correlate research that the city of Chicago, that folks in the city of Chicago have been doing, that have been identifying flood risk that we haven't been talking about in a public conversation for a very long time. And so this incorporates the type of flooding that we experience when our yards are flooded, our basements are flooded, our streets are flooded, and it impacts our lives. Whether we can get to work, whether we can get to school, whether we can work from home, whether our property is damaged. So not only is flooding identified as an issue here in Chicago, but we're seeing this is happening across the US, west of the Rockies, east of the Rockies, in the South, in Canada, in Mexico, everywhere in North America, and much of the world is actually experiencing flooding. In fact, flooding is the most damaging disaster that we experience in the US and likely in all of North America. And it's getting worse. We know that flooding is now becoming worse because of changes in climate, because of a climate crisis where temperatures are increasing or decreasing depending on where you are. And we're getting, in our region, increasingly severe and increasingly large rain events. So when it rains, not every time, but many times, especially when we've had these major storms recently or earlier in May, those rain events are potentially more damaging. They potentially drop more rain in a shorter period of time or over a longer period of time. And this is different than it was many years ago. But I do want to say, this is not a new problem. I've done a little bit of background research on when did people start talking about flooding and urban flooding. And some of the earliest writing that I can see in the city of Chicago is around the end of the 19th century. And already at this time, engineers are thinking about, they're reversing the Chicago River, but they're also thinking about, well, how do we manage the water that's flooding our communities? Not just the sanitation needs, which is one of the major drivers for the river reversal, but how do we manage the floodwaters that are damaging our homes, and decreasing the viability of the Chicago economy, of our communities. And it continues. In fact, this middle number should actually be not 1968, but 1929. Rain deluges city is boon to corn crops. So it's a plus and a minus. We get more rain for our downstate crops, but it floods our cities. And then later in 1968, flood brings misery a second time to a Southsider. So we know from these public records, these news records, that flooding has been happening for well over a century, and probably much longer. Now, flooding was not a problem until we built a city on top of the wetlands, the complex of wetlands that serve our region. And we tried to kind of hold back the floodwaters. And as a result, we're seeing flood damage. So the first thing I'm going to move into is kind of the types of flooding that we experience in our region. So I tend to think about three types of urban flooding that affect homes or properties. And the first one, and if you look at this, let's see, I'll get a pointer out here. Hopefully you can see this. If you look at this diagram, this red arrow is the kind of surface of the ground, and this here is intended to represent the street. This diagram is a section through the street, through the yard, through the building, through the backyard, and what you can see is kind of the interior of the house. Here's the roof, this is the first floor, and this is the basement. And what it's showing is a diagram of how the building's sewer systems connect and how the interior plumbing connects to the building. And I want to call out a few things before we get started too far. First, the yard slopes towards the house. Many of our bungalows, unfortunately, are buildings that have, when they were installed, the foundations were backfilled with soil that was excavated, and it's settled over time. So, and the water continues to infiltrate down near our foundation. So it's actually pitched towards our house, which is opposite of how it should be. So that's one thing to notice. The second thing to notice is the cracks in the foundation. The third thing to notice is that there is a sewer that connects the building through floor drains, through vent pipes that connect toilets and sinks and bathtubs and laundry, and that there's water also that's running off the roof. So in a situation where you have sewer backup in your house, typically that's referring to water that is backing up from a city sewer, from the main sewer that's in and under your street, and backing up into your house. And sometimes this is, we'll say, surcharging from the sewer, meaning there is water that's actually coming from your neighbors and maybe a neighboring community because the sewer's reached capacity, And they say water finds its level. So it ends up actually backing up the line and up into your basement. So again, I'm going to do this thing where I say, raise your hand if you've experienced sewer backup. There we go, sewer backup in your basement. Lots of people raising their hands. And there's typically two types. There's the kind of stormwater backup we get when sometimes, different from what I've already explained, maybe you have a blockage in your line. Maybe it's tree roots, maybe it's a kid's toy and some toilet paper. Maybe it's those flushable wipes that aren't really flushable. Maybe it's the fats, oils, and greases that you dump down your drain. These are all things that could cause an obstruction. And if your roof gutters are connected to your sewer, they could be kind of backing up behind the rainwater could be backing up behind your basement's your home sewer and then flooding into your basement. Now the other type is the one we more commonly associate with sewage or sewer backup, and this is the dark, dirty, dank, smelly water that contains everything that was flushed or drained out of our house. Fats, oils, greases, bodily waste, everything. It's disgusting, it's dangerous. If this happens in your house, strongly advise you not to step in the water. Not only is it a risk of infection or contracting disease or infection, but it's also anytime you step into water in a house, it could be connected to an electrical circuit. So it's super dangerous. Don't go into it. The next type of water in our homes that commonly looking at is foundation seepage or infiltration through foundation walls. And this it's typically usually it may be a little less damaging, certainly a little less gross in most situations, but it can be equally impactful to a home's value. It can be very impactful to the health of the occupants. And the reason for this is water coming through those foundation walls. In many of our bungalows, our partially finished or fully finished bungalows, is getting trapped behind drywall, which is often covered in a paper that mold loves to grow on, or it's trapped behind a piece of plywood panel or wood. All things that moisture and heat and constant temperature allows, kind of facilitates the growth of mold. And so in many of our basements that have these wall coverings, the infiltration is a really strong source of mold growth. And if you have allergies, or many people develop allergies as a result of these sorts of water infiltration situations, it can become a real hazard for living and occupying these spaces. So the third type is more yard flooding, and probably of these three, it's the one that tends to be least problematic, though I would not say that across the board. It is, it's more of nuisance flooding for a lot of people. It means that maybe you can't use your yard after a rain event. Maybe it takes a very long time to dry out, or it never does. You can't establish grass. Maybe it means that in the wintertime, it ices up and it becomes hazardous for you or your family to be able to use that space, and extremely dangerous to slipping and falling. And again, I had pointed out earlier that in this situation, when you have water that's flooding, where your yard is actually sloped back to your foundation, it becomes kind of a double risk, not only of any water ponding and pooling in your yard, but also directing water towards your foundation, and thus risking that infiltration that we just talked about. So while it might not sound that bad at first, it really is one of those critical aspects, and things you can do is to change the grade of this, of the landscape around your house, and start to eliminate some of those sources of yard flooding. So we're going to move into this next section, and again, we're starting to get some questions. Please continue. I think we're going to hold on until we get a little bit further. So this next section is going to be around kind of identifying in your home, what can you do to identify you have a problem. Now, some of you who raised your hands earlier who got the sewage in the basement, you know you have a problem. But humor me, I'm going to walk through this for everybody who may be new to a home, has just bought a home. Many people who participate in these bungalow seminars are brand new homeowners, have never gone down into a basement before, and realize now that they are the person who has to figure out what to do. So this is for old homeowners, seasoned veteran homeowners, new homeowners, and everybody in between. So we're going to walk through a series of kind of identification opportunities. So the first, we talked about sewer backup. What it is clean stormwater coming in from your gutters, potentially from breaks in your sewer line. It is sewage that's backing out that can be a result, as I said earlier, of the sewers, the city sewers surcharging flowing back into your property, or could be because of a obstruction on your property. Where do you see it? It could be in a couple places, and sometimes I'll get questions. My toilet's backing up when it rains, and my toilet is on the first floor or the second floor. That tends to not be associated with sewer backup. However, if you have a toilet in the basement and it's backing up during a rain event, or your laundry is not able to drain out, your utility sinks, these could be associated with sewer backup. Often, though, they'll be part and parcel to another type of set of problems, unless that is you're getting a foot, 2 feet, 3 feet of water when sewer backs up. So as a homeowner, the things I encourage you to do, especially if you're a new homeowner, the first time it rains in your house, especially if it's a big rain, go down into the basement. Turn the light on, bring a flashlight, try to get a sense for, is there water that's coming into my basement, and particularly look at the floor drains, because the floor drain tends to be at the lowest point in one of the lowest points in your basement. You might have multiple floor drains, and you might also have floor drains that are under tile or covered up out in previous renovations. Not a good strategy, but it does happen. So if you do have sewage backup, especially if you have black water, dirty water, the first thing I'd recommend is just calling a licensed plumber. Definitely don't stand in it. It can be the health risk, but you might have an obstruction. You might also it might also be a condition that is televising a sewer will at least give you a sense of whether it's a bigger neighborhood problem as well. So the next type, we talked about infiltration and seepage. One way to identify that is, again, go down during a rain event. And this is going to be a common recommendation for all these kind of inspections, is when it's raining, right after it's rained, are two really good times to associate water inside your home or on your property with that rain event. Now, I'll just say blanket statement. If you're getting water in your home and it hasn't rained in a week or more, there may be something else at play. So if anybody, I'd love to hear questions in the Q&A. If you're having that problem, please put it in there. We don't tend to have a lot of high water table issues in the city, but there are neighborhoods that do. So basement walls, what is it? So if you look at this photo here on the right of the screen, the infiltration tends to be coming in from some kind of crack. In this photo, while it's not an incredibly clear photo, it starts to show a couple things. That water is coming in at this, let me pull up so water's coming in at the vertical crack in the foundation. So it's where the two foundation walls come together. And our homes can be constructed in a lot of different ways, but the joints of these two foundations, or the intersections of these two foundation walls can be one place where there's instability or there's a vertical crack. There tends to be joining there, but we all live in different buildings. Another place can be at the cove joint, or the joint between the floor foundation and the vertical wall. Another place where you could be getting water would be at the top of the foundation, at the sill of the foundation. And that's an important place to keep an eye on, especially when you start to get outside into kind of an exterior yard flooding situation, yard flood assessment. We'll talk a little bit about that outside, but that can be a weak point where water can be actually overtopping that foundation and coming through. So if I'm going into a basement to understand what is it, has this building experienced some kind of flood risk or water damage, I'm looking at all the normal cracks and joints, all the vertical joints, all the horizontal joints, all the top of foundation joints. I'm also looking for anything that's unusual. So in this photo, you can see that there is a bit of peeling of the paint. There's also these dark spots. So let me start with the dark spot. The dark spot tends to be a stain. It can be that it's still wet, which I think it was in this situation, but it's also a deposit of sediment, mineral, whatever's in that water over time and settles on those wet spots. So the discoloration is a really good sign that there's been water or some kind of something in the past. You can also see that there's kind of a drainage path for this water. So it'll give you a sense of where it's going, maybe how much is coming in. So this looks like more of a trickle, but I imagine in a big rain event, it's more severe. And then we have this this kind of bubbling, peeling of the paint that is a sign that water is moving through the wall. So before I move on, and I'm just checking my time real quick. One good way, if you have cracks outside your building or inside your building, inside the wall, you can identify. So just take a garden hose, and if you don't mind adding a little bit more water into your basement, turning it on and putting it outside the crack. So finding that place outside these cracks on the interior of your basement wall and putting the hose out there and just seeing what happens if you run it for 15, 20, 30 minutes. Is there a lot of water that's coming in? If it comes in so quickly, you might have a pretty severe crack that needs some kind of repair or epoxy to actually block that drainage. So the next thing is just to keep an eye on the other kind of holes, or blanking on this, but doors and windows. Anything that's that is a hole or a gap in your foundation wall. And in this picture, the homeowner most likely replaced this window for security reasons, but they might have also replaced it because the old wood seals had rotted out because of moisture damage. And you can see that they've added a caulk joint down here at the bottom. It's not the prettiest thing, but it helps to seal out the water that's falling on this edge. So things to be looking for, or if you're at the bottom of the basement stairwell, is there a drain? Is the drain clear? If you go out during a rain event, is the drain actually filling up? Is that area of the stairwell filling up and not draining out? Does it take days to drain out? So that could be that could mean you have a blocked drain. You need to address that at some point in the future. But yeah, start with an inspection of the windows, the door wells, and move on to any other kind of gaps coming through the foundation. It might be pipes, heating vents, other things that allow water in. The next thing, and this is actually one of the first things I look at, but it comes a little bit later in this presentation, is looking at downspouts and standpipes. And these are the vertical pipe that connects your gutter at the top of your building, the horizontal gutter that takes the water or captures the water off the roof and puts it into a vertical pipe that connects typically down into the city of Chicago's sewer. Now, in this photo, I like this photo because it is a very urgent and ragged fix to their problem. It was that you can see that they've added in, they've kind of gnawed off this pipe in some way, and have added in a bend in the pipe, and this pipe laying down on the ground, I expect, was intended to direct water away. Now, what is actually happening is the water's coming down this pipe, and instead of moving away to the front yard, because this pipe is dropped to the ground, it is all displacing down to the foundation, and you can see a bunch of mold and moss growth, the discoloration along the brick that suggests there's a lot of humidity in this area. And indeed, inside this house, there's a lot of moisture moving through the foundation wall here. And one of the challenges I just call out, in our bungalows, we often have gutter systems that come down along the side, the gangways, the side areas between our houses. And in many of these neighborhoods, there's not a lot of area between the two buildings. It might be 5 feet, it might be 15 feet. So what some bungalow owners have done, and this was done originally, was that they would put downspouts at the 4 corners or at the front and back of the house, usually to try to match the architectural character. Many don't like this as a feature because it can be hard to route, but it is an effective way to get water way. And this often requires you to reroute or repitch your gutters. Just do real quick. Just readjust my screen real quick. All of you out there. Okay. So foundations and sidewalks, another place to be careful and inspect very thoroughly. In this photo, what you can see is a sidewalk and then a dip down and a informal paver path. What's happening here is that water is actually pooling in the lowest spot. The water tries to find the lowest spot. In this case, the water is pooling and actually moving down into the soil and adjacent to both housing foundations and through the foundations because they were old foundations, they were leaking, they were cracked. So I strongly encourage you to have a good sense of what's the grading around your house. Where are the low points? Are the low points at the side of the building, between buildings? Are they adjacent to the foundation? Likely what you're going to need to do is to address how water is being directed to this area. So moving the downspouts, adjusting the gutters, starting from the roof down, and figuring out what can we do to get water out of these constrained spaces and these spaces near sidewalks. Then, one of the final kind of cues during an assessment or steps in an assessment is to just take a look around the yard. What are we experiencing from rain events? Where can we see evidence of scouring from too much water or low points where water is settling, compaction where lawn is not growing? A good way to start to identify where you might be able to make change is to look for those low points, to identify where in the landscape, if you're trying to grow grass, grass cannot grow, or you have perennially wet soils where you step on the ground and it just squashes down. Now, there could be a number of reasons why you have wet soil and it's been dry for a week or 2 weeks. You could have a pipe leak, especially if you have, if you're getting these wet soils in your front yard and it's been dry for a long time. So inspect during dry weather, inspect during wet weather, have a good sense of how the water might flow on your property. A good trick, if you're, and this works for the sidewalks, this works for the yards where there's a hard surface, take a ping pong ball to get a sense of what the slope is. Does it slope to or away from your foundation? Put the ping pong ball at the foundation. If it doesn't move, the slope is coming back. If it does roll away, well, you probably got a pretty decent slope. Just a little trick. And then, and I did not update this slide, but essentially what I was going to say here is streets and alleys. So there are many ways that our neighborhoods flood, and one of them is that the streets can be intentionally used by the city to store excess rainwater. This is actually can be a very good thing for many of our neighborhoods where we get a lot of sewer backup. So the city will put in some where there is dramatic flooding occurring, they can put in restrictors into the sewer system. And what the restrictor does is take a pipe that's very big in a catch basin where water's coming in from the street and restricts the outflow to the sewer in a way that allows, that kind of meters the water. And so the thinking there is it's better on the street than in your basement. It's better on the street than in your basement. So if you're getting flooding in the street, it might be because the city is trying to help out the neighbors around you. Now, if it's flooding your car, this is a different story. If it's coming up above the doors into the engine, that can be really dramatic. You definitely need to report these sort of things to the city. And this slide about streets and alleys is something where I'm strongly encouraging folks, when you see something, say something to the city. You can call your alderman, you can call 311 to report flooding, especially if it's causing any kind of public risk, public health risk to you, your neighbors, people in your community. So we're going to move into the kind of third part of this presentation, and we're about 30-something minutes in. I see we've got 15 great questions. We're going to continue to hold those, but if I've said anything that gives you pause or you have a question about, please put it in there. I will also suggest, every presentation, I learn from people who participate, news stories, types of flooding, sometimes corrections. All of this is great information. Feel free to put it in. There's no bad input, um, unless you critique my quarantine haircut, but you can do that too. So we're going to move into the next part of the presentation, and this is that third part, what you can do, those low cost, no cost fixes for flooding or water infiltration or water damage at your property. I'm going to go through not the most exhaustive list, but it's intended to be a comprehensive list of actionable things that you can do that most homeowners could act on. Though knowing that everybody has different abilities, different time allocations, different money situations, these are intended to be accessible by you, by a neighbor, somebody you trust in your community who might be able to help you out. So let's get started. Low or no cost improvements to your property. So the first one, and this is actually, we'll back up just a second. The first one are very practical things that you can do inside your house. And this is when you're cooking, don't dump fats, oils, or greases down the sink. When you are cleaning your house and you're using those flushable wipes, don't flush them. They don't do anything except get stuck in the sewer pipes. They're not really flushable. So those are two big things that homeowners can do to reduce the risk that your property will experience sewer backup and that your community's properties will experience reduced risk of sewer backup. Because what happens with both of those, the combination of the fats, oils, greases, and those non-flushable flushable wipes, they don't decompose in the sewer systems, is that they form giant accumulations and they actually end up restricting the capacity of your sewers. Now, the city does clean sewers, but they can't keep up with the amount of fats, oils, greases, and flushable wipes in our city. So I strongly encourage you, if you use those things, throw them in the trash. If you create a lot of fats, oils, and greases in your cooking, put it in the trash. It's the best situation for your home, for your property, for your community. The next thing, these are more typical home maintenance things. So the first one, and this is a really important one, and it really is important to kind of stay on top of it. And this is cleaning debris from your gutters. Now, some of you might not have very many trees around your house, and you probably are lucky to not have a lot of obstructions. But many of us in Chicago, we were fortunate to live in a community where there are trees, at least some trees on our blocks. And whether wind blown or the trees are dropping leaves directly on your house or branches or other things, it's really important to keep those gutters clean. They're one of the first lines of defense for keeping your property watertight, preventing backup and water damage to your roof, to your building walls, and ultimately to keeping water away from your foundation. So I'll just start by saying one of the reasons this is so important, especially for our brick bungalows and for keeping our roofs in good condition, is that blocked up gutters can lead to a variety of different damages. It can cause gutters to overspill and then flow down the facade of your brick building, of your wood building, and this can lead to decay and moisture in walls that when freeze and thaw happens, we can actually get a lot of spalling of bricks, loss of pointing, which is sacrificial, but that loss of the brick is really critical to the health of our homes. Backing up gutters can lead to water getting under shingles and into roof cavities, which can lead to a lot of rot and damage and moist ceiling damage and other damage along our building walls. So strongly encouraged to clean our gutters, and this photo is a great example of somebody who's taking a lot of precautions. I don't know that I would typically wear a hard hat going up a ladder, but I would certainly take precautions and encourage you to read up on taking precautions on using ladders and cleaning gutters, or hire somebody or ask a neighbor or family member who you know is confident in dealing with gutters. Falls off ladders are very dangerous. So strongly encourage you to take necessary precautions. Should you want to take the next step, and actually, let me say, seasonally, spring, fall, really good times to clean your gutters. If you have a lot of debris or after a storm, you might need to do it more frequently. But if you want to take a next step, you can add guards or strainers to your gutters, to the vertical channels or just at the downspouts. There are supposedly self-cleaning gutters, though I've heard various successes with those. You can also, if you're looking to make an investment, actually replace your existing gutters and go for a wider and a deeper profile. They can be materials that match the kind of historic character of your bungalow, or modernize them in contemporary materials, shapes, whatever. That's up to you. It's an option. It's encouraged if you're having problems with the pitch of your roof and water coming, kind of overspilling your existing gutters. The next thing, and this is again a fairly easy DIY, do-it-yourself fix for homes, is disconnecting your downspout from the sewer. You might do this because you're having that clear water backing up into your basement, so storm water that's overfilling your sewer during big rain events. It's fairly straightforward. You might be able to disconnect the downspout at an existing joint, or like this photo suggests, cut the existing downspout at a height where you can put an extension on that will drain the water away. Now, there's a couple things to know about this. In the city of Chicago, the city did make it legal to disconnect your downspout by city ordinance if you do a couple things. First, you have to seal up the standpipe, the connection to the sewer from which the downspout was connected. Second, you have to ensure that the downspout has, and the water that comes out of it does not go onto your neighbor's property. And third, it has to go across your property into an alley or a street, and a catchment basin or a drain in the alley or the street. Now that can sound a little complicated, and many of you might say, well, my neighbor is sending their downspout water to my property. And I hear that so many times, and often when I do these presentations, I'll ask a show of hands, whose neighbor is sending the water? And it's everybody's hands up. And then I ask who is sending water to their neighbor, and it's nobody's hands up. And if you run the numbers, it's like, well, somebody must be sending water somewhere. How does that work? Anyway, disconnecting downspouts, a pretty easy fix to getting water out of your home sewers. It may contribute to reducing the flow that your home is sending into your neighboring sewer, your neighborhood sewer, and may reduce your risk of flooding. But again, don't send water to your neighbors. Very important. If you disconnect your downspout, you need to extend it, and you can extend it in a number of different ways. And actually, before I go back, I should finish that last slide. The upgrades that you can make is you can go for a larger diameter downspout. You can also upgrade where that water drains extending from the downspout, and that's what I'll talk about next. So extending the downspout to your yard, you might want to do this if the water is already discharging near your foundation. It's scouring. You can see like like a hole where the water's landing, and it's just bare soil and stone. And you have water inside. This is a great opportunity to extend that downspout out into the yard. And what you want to do when you're doing this is to make sure that the water gets far enough away from your foundation that it's not going to infiltrate back into your foundation. And the kind of number I keep in my head is about 10 feet. And the reason many people say 10 feet is that even in the most dense soils, water tends to, if it's not overland flooding, water tends to kind of migrate down at kind of a 30 or 45 degree angle. So you kind of 1 foot over, 1 foot down, 1 foot over, 1 foot down. So if your basement's only 5 feet deep, then maybe 5 feet or 6 feet from your foundation is okay. But if it's 8 feet or it's 10 feet, you actually have a lot of distance to cover. So the safer, the farther you can discharge this downspout, the better. Now, if you want to, move from a $10 coil to something a little nicer, a little fancier, you can use like an underground infiltration trench, a French drain, or a underground drain downspout with a infiltration basin at the end, or a pop-up emitter. Essentially, what I'm saying here is instead of having this black pipe on your lawn or across your yard, it can be a trip hazard. You could actually bury it underground. You need to be careful about the freeze-thaw cycle. You don't want there to be obstructions. You want to be able to clean that pipe if you do install it. Otherwise, you could end up having water back up near your foundation, doing the opposite of what you hoped to accomplish with that fix. And then this other one, this is a fairly common fix. I'll see a lot of caulking and repairing with different different sealants at homes. Sometimes tar, bitumen, the kind of stuff you put on a roof, the black brittle stuff. That's horrible to put on your building. It doesn't expand, it splits, it cracks, it's hard to get off, it's nasty to work with the first time. You want to caulk and seal the cracks in the joints near your property, because if there's water sitting on the top, this decreases the chance of water getting in. So this photo, you see a couple things. They have sealed the sidewalk, the joint between the sidewalk and the brick foundation. They are also sealing this stress crack in the sidewalk, the concrete sidewalk. And the hope is that water falling on the surface isn't going straight down into this stress crack or the crack at the foundation. Now, the thing you have to keep in mind is where that water flows next. So if it just flows off the edge of the sidewalk and then migrates under the sidewalk back to your foundation, you haven't solved the problem fully. So you do need to probably connect it to one of these other fixes around draining the area near the foundation. If you want to invest a little more time or money, you can repair the sidewalk, replace the sidewalk, seal the joints. You don't have to pour new concrete. You could use the existing concrete and see, you could mud jack the existing concrete, which is a way of using kind of water pressure essentially to like jack it up and then stabilizing the new height with a slurry mix of concrete and soil, essentially. Some people have success with it. I've not personally seen it used, but I do hear reports of that being used in the region pretty successfully. And then installing some sort of grading or drain to be able to take water away from these foundations that's lower than the foundation joints or the cracks is really critical. Now, again, I'm just talking about some of this. One of the other really key fixes is sloping the yard away from the foundation. And this might require a little bit of effort. In this photo, this is a neighbor, this is a homeowner in kind of west side of the city who was having a lot of infiltration through their foundation. And there were low points throughout. They ended up elevating the foundation to just about the top of their foundation line. It's covered because they have some bark they've covered it up with, and they've planted some native perennial grasses that have, at this point, I believe, pretty deep roots and are kind of taking some of the moisture out of the soil. So this is one way to start to address some of that perennial moisture or frequent moisture in and around foundations. But also during rain events, now the water is flowing off onto the sidewalk as opposed to sitting next to the foundation. Now, if you want to spend a lot more money in this situation, and this is something that many folks do as well in our region, which is excavating down to the footing, installing a perimeter drain, a footing drain, and connecting it to a sump pump or an injector pump inside the house, sending it to the sewer. This is kind of a pretty expensive and intense investment, but for some homeowners who really care about the dryness and the security of their basement, it can be a good investment. Again, it's not typically cheap. It's not a quick project. It takes excavating the entire foundation and putting drain in around the entire foundation. People will do it for you, and some people will charge you a lot of money, and some people will charge you a little money and do it wrong. So be careful, and certainly select a good contractor if you are going to go that route, or if you're going to do it yourself, get a good shovel and protect your back. Then another, and this is going back to my kind of original bias, another tool that you can use in your toolkit of addressing water is installing a rain garden, some kind of biofiltration, green infrastructure. And this is essentially a piece of, it's a mix of soil and plants that both hold water on the surface and allow it to soak down quickly into the soils during rain events. And this example here, there's two examples, but they have just a little bit of ponding at the surface. You can see on this top example that there's a downspout that's draining into this rain garden, this small rain garden, and it has stone at the bottom to prevent the scouring from this high velocity water that's coming out of the gutters. And they're very new plants. They were just installed, and I think at this point it's a pretty mature garden. It takes a couple of years to really establish and for the grasses and perennials to fill in. But it can be formal, it can be informal, it can be naturalistic, it can be very contemporary and structured. You have a lot of choices with these sorts of tools, but like the downspout extension, install it far enough away from the foundation so it's not directing water back into your home. There are a lot of good contractors in the region who will consult, install, design, build these sorts of pieces of infrastructure. If you have more time or money, build a bigger rain garden. Some people actually put stone underneath their gardens, and some people build deeper gardens. Some people put larger shrubs in there. Some put trees within rain gardens. There's a lot of different techniques around the types of soil, the amount of sand and compost and different amendments you can add into the soil that you can track to really build a beautiful rain garden or a piece of green infrastructure on your property in your yard. And strongly encourage people to think about how they might be able to add these elements to their property. And I've seen also situations where multiple neighbors come together to build rain gardens that are shared, where they're all sharing the cost and they're moving across their the rain gardens are placed across their property line. So if you like your neighbor a lot, you guys might be able to make an investment together. And then one of the other things that is promoted a lot to bungalow owners and have been free in the past through the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District is rain barrels. Typically, a rain barrel is a tool that's most useful for kind of education around water reuse and conservation. A typical rain barrel that has been given away free through our utilities, through the Bungalow Association, is fairly small. It's about 55 gallons. So for many of our homes, the roofs are much larger and generate much larger volumes of water during a typical rain event for any of our single downspouts. And so if you were going to install a rain barrel on a downspout, just make sure that you understand the volume of water that's coming into these barrels, and don't expect that it's going to solve all the problems. You might have to create an overflow route for the rain barrel to actually send the water off the property or away from your foundation. So if you're going to go this route, just be cognizant that it's not going to solve a flooding problem, but it may give you a source of water that is cheaper than using city water to water your vegetable garden or perennial gardens, yard gardens. Now, you can make bigger investments in rainwater harvesting. There's very complex, interesting systems that are out there now, especially if you look to places that are more arid or dry than Chicago. But there are above ground ornamental cisterns that are quite beautiful and artistic. There are below ground cisterns, and a cistern, typically refer to a cistern as 500 gallons or about 10 rain barrels or more. And so if it's above ground and it's elevated up, it's a lot of weight, it's a lot of water. You got to make sure it's incredibly secure, but it can gravity drain out with a hose. If it's below ground, you're going to need a pump, and you're going to want to make sure that you can actually make sure that it's in both of these situations. You want to make sure that they're empty in the winter because there are freeze-thaw cycles. But they can both be connected to irrigation systems, so drip systems or pump-based systems. And then this is, I always throw this in because this is kind of an old Chicago fix. It is, if you have water that's backing up into your basement, and this is just a little bit of water physics, I guess, I don't know, it's water, you know, it's about water and fluid dynamics and water finding its height. So in this situation, in this photo, what you're seeing is a piece of pipe. It's about 2.5 feet long, and it's actually threaded into the drain pipe. Many of our drains actually have a thread inside, and it's designed to fit, or historically was designed to fit many of our galvanized pipe threads. And this, believe it or not, if you typically get 2 inches of water across your entire basement floor, and you have one drain and you put in a standpipe, this will solve your problem. Don't hold me liable for that, but that 2 inches of water across your entire foundation is only 2 inches of water in this pipe. It has something to do with water finding its level. I can't explain it to you. It's magic. It's also really affordable. The things you have to consider is that that thread has to be really secure, and many of our old drains are not super secure. Now, if you want to take a little bit more time or invest a little bit more money in some technology, you can buy water sensors that kind of give you a sense for when water is coming out of a drain. You can also install gate valves or backflow preventers. I've seen some questions already in the comments about what about backflow preventers, how can you install them, how do you know if they exist? Those are ways to kind of prevent water from backing up from the city sewer, but they will not address your issue if you actually have a blockage within your sewer and you're getting water backing up that's clean water from your gutters or from your house. Okay, so we're going to do this. We're going to wrap up this presentation. I've just provided a few different resources here. So if you want to find a local contractor who can help you out, the Bungalow Association has their trusted referrals page. It is a great resource. I personally use it all the time as a homeowner. I can vouch for many of the contractors on here. Check it out if you haven't already. You can look up your flood risk. These are 2 different websites that are very interesting to help you understand what's the risk of flooding in your community. You can learn more about urban flooding, the different types, the different fixes, go in depth on any of the things I've suggested earlier. You can also prepare for a flood. If you are more of a prepper and you're excited about preparing for the next disaster, there's plenty of resources out there through the American Red Cross, through FEMA. There is also flood insurance, which I don't talk much about because it tends to not be a good value for many people. But it tends to be more affordable if you're not in a flood zone. It's hard to determine whether you're going to get a payout from it, so it might not be a good investment, but it does exist, and some private insurers do provide flood insurance. So if you do have any questions, I have offered in the past to do site consultations, assessments for bungalow homeowners. I have not been doing them in the time of COVID, but just starting to do them again. We'll do a virtual visit if that's something that folks want. But really, if you have a question, you can always send me an email. Easy questions, I will answer, no problem, no charge. I just love doing this work. So please keep the questions coming, reach out, send me a photo if you have a problem you want some advice on. I'm more than happy to do quick answers where I can, and make connections to contractors if that's relevant. So I'm going to wrap up here, and I think we're going to move into questions. Is that right?
Yep, that is right. Thank you so much. That was great. I was also like cracking up on the other side of this during several points, and I'm sorry that we were not able to share that with you. I know it's nice to get that feedback. So that was great. And we have really great questions on here too. Some of them kind of overlap, so we can answer a few, at a time, I think. But let's just start with the earliest one first. And you guys, just another reminder, some people asked also in the questions, we're going to be sending out a recording of this to everybody. I know some of you came a little bit later. So we're going to send a recording of this to everybody who signed up. If you joined late for some reason and weren't able to sign up, just shoot us an email and we'll send it to you as well. No problem. But thank you all for being here. And let's just start from the beginning. We can, you know, we were supposed to wrap up at 7, I know, according to the invite. Ryan's cool, and I'm certainly cool with staying till, you know, 7:15, so we can probably get through most of these. So the first question we had was, I have a huge tree in front of my house on the city's easement. Isn't the city responsible for my flooding? I hear a lot.
Yeah, that's a great question. We get a lot of concerns, and first I would say trees in our city are an amazing asset. They help keep our homes cool, and we find that if we cut trees down, remove trees, can be the cure can be worse than the problem. So I'd be cautious about removing the tree or assigning responsibility without knowing a little bit more about your problem. But here's what I'll say. There are many trees that are thirstier than others, and their tree roots do find their way into our pipes. In that case, if you're getting frequent sewer backup, the thing that I would first recommend is to have a licensed plumber or drain layer into your property and ask them to televise the sewer. Ask them to show you watch them televise it and show you the video. And if you see a lot of tree roots, there's kind of a couple fixes. The first and easiest is that they can rod or jet the sewer pipe and actually clean it out. Now, those tree roots will likely grow back. And yes, you could cut the tree down, but your house will likely get a little bit hotter, or your neighbor's house will likely get a little bit hotter. With a lot of folks, if you can afford to clean your sewer in that way, I strongly recommend going with that, televising and regular cleaning.
Oops, sorry. Next question. The cicadas are very loud, and since I'm home, I can't do much about it. So I'm muting myself in between, sorry.
Yeah.
So the next question was, I have leaks coming in from the south side of my basement. Is it due to my neighbor's house being so close? Which you kind of talked about, but.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I'm not sure exactly. A couple things I would wonder is, what's your neighborhood? How close is your neighbor's property? Is their downspout disconnected? Is your downspout disconnected? Depending on where the leak is within the basement, if it's coming in through the back door, well, maybe it's coming down the stairs. Look at what's the drainage there. If it's coming in through the foundation, I would ask, is the downspout or standpipe right outside that crack? Because sometimes, even if the downspout's not disconnected, the standpipe can be cracked underground. And this happens in a lot of our houses when there starts to get an obstruction where we haven't cleaned our gutters, and trees, leaves, branches have gotten down to the pipes. In the winter, it freezes, it expands, that terracotta pipe or steel pipe even shatters, and we get drainage along our foundation. So it's hard to say what the problem is, but I would look first at your property, start at the roof, go down through the downspouts, gutters, downspouts, looking at the grade, looking inside to try to get a sense. It might be very obvious, though. It could be that your neighbors have directed their downspout to your foundation. And in that case, I would say, with your kindest voice and best cake or pie, ask them to relocate it to their yard.
Okay, we have a few of you had written in about, in your basements, you have the white powder on your bricks in the basement, and peeling paint. Laverne asked if they need a sump pump. But if you could maybe, Ryan, just kind of talk about like what's going on there with that white powder, why does it happen, and what can be done in general about it?
Yeah, so typically the white powder is referred to as efflorescence. It's a mineral deposit that results from water moving through the mineral, or it could be fieldstone, it could be limestone, it could be brick, it could be concrete. When the water is moving through these foundations, because they're all porous, even if they have a seal on one side, a sealant, there's water moving through these walls because they're porous materials, then it's pulling some of the mineral out with it. So the efflorescence on its own is not a sign of extreme damage. It's typically not something to worry too much about. But what it is saying is that there's water, there's moisture more than water. There's moisture in that wall. And so when I see efflorescence on a wall, I start to look outside. So it might be a situation where if you're trying to get that efflorescence away, or bubbling paint, or whatever it is that's moisture moving through your wall, look outside, see if maybe it's the soils are staying moist throughout the year, and you might want to like add some perennial plants that are going to pull some of that moisture out of the soil, or you might need to move water away from your foundation. But typically, it's a sign of moisture within the wall. It typically is not the efflorescence isn't typically damaging the wall. Now, if you're seeing the brick face or the stone face actually splitting off, you're starting to get into a different situation. And if you ever see a horizontal crack near any efflorescence, there's a much bigger risk that your wall could collapse, or you have another problem at play. So diagonal cracks tend to be settling cracks. Vertical cracks tend to be settling, or just a stress crack at a joint. Horizontal cracks, really bad in the foundation wall. Call a structural engineer and don't go down there.
Just to piggyback off that one, there was one that came in a little bit later, and you sort of addressed this, but I have seepage coming in between the top of the foundation and the brick in my basement. Is there a way to seal this? I had a waterproofing company come out, and they said it's not possible to seal these types of leaks. So just that second part about waterproofing, you talked about other ways to sort of prevent the water from coming into the wall, but I'm assuming that means like the waterproof coating that people want to put on brick.
Yeah.
In these instances, if you could just kind of address that part of it too.
Yeah. So, so the best way to waterproof your house is from the outside in. So you can buy all sorts of waterproofing polymers, blah 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 blah. If you're going to put, you want to keep the water out. So if you're going to put a waterproofing barrier on your foundation, it's best if you do it from the outside. A lot of companies will install a dimple board, or a rigid plastic board, or insulation even, that's sealed on the exterior. Some will use tars or other thin waterproofing coatings on the outside. It has to be dry, it has to be a good seal, good contact. And then they'll tend to put in a foundation drain. Some will do a waterproofing coating on the inside, a paint or polymer applied, painted onto the wall or sprayed onto the wall. I don't tend to recommend these. This is kind of holding moisture into the wall. You don't want moisture in your wall. You want moisture to either move through. And so in the situation where waterproofing is applied on the inside, the best situation that I tend to see is a board that allows water to kind of move through the wall, through the wall, and collects it behind the board and sends it down to a footing drain, maybe to a sump pump or an injector pump or your home sewer. But waterproofing materials, and certainly paint, are not going to stop the problem. It will continue to be moist if it's moist today.
Thank you. Okay, is it better to keep my gutters going into the sewer, or to remove them from the sewer and redirect the water from the gutters? And if I could just add to this, also, I know that it's different. There's not always an easy place, there's not always grass or something for that water to drain into in our gangways. So I know that that's a common question as well that we get a lot.
Yeah, this is site by site. I couldn't answer it without seeing the site. I tend to think that as if everybody disconnected their downspouts today, our neighborhoods would probably flood. But if some people disconnect their downspouts and are able to modify the soils in their yards, there's likely to be less flooding in our communities. And so I would encourage you to look into disconnecting your downspout. But if you have a downspout that's on the side of your bungalow and you have a neighbor close by and their downspouts already disconnected, or you already have water ponding near your foundation, I would probably not recommend disconnecting the downspout as a first solution. Now, if you have sewer backup or clear water backup in your basement, it may be more urgent to get that out. But again, if that's the situation, first televise the sewer, then start to look at how you might be able to relocate that downspout.
Just a quick one. Is there a way to determine if you have a check valve?
Yeah, this is a good question. So sometimes there's not like a standard place that a check valve would be installed, but a couple places to look is in your front yard. You might have a very old cover or pipe that's covered over with a stone or a cap. Now, some of these will be the water shutoff valve. Sometimes it'll actually be a gate valve that you can turn on or off. So it would be in your front yard. Sometimes a gate valve or a backflow preventer valve is installed under the floor and will have a plastic or a metal cap that you can screw off and see. Sometimes it's all installed on the floor and then there's vinyl tile put on top. So I would look for any unusual covers or patches in your basement, and also for any covers or access panels in your yard. And that could be a way to identify a gate valve or a backflow preventer.
Okay, I have an above ground sewer system, but I have a drain in the middle of my basement floor that when it rains heavily, the water comes up through that drain. How can I stop that water from coming back up through the drain?
Yeah, this is a good question. So it's a little hard to know what the kind of plumbing system is there, but I will say a lot of folks have above ground sewers, and that just means that the sewer that leaves your house is leaving at above the basement floor level. Maybe it's 2 feet up, maybe it's 4 feet up, but it's closer to the surface of the yard than to your basement floor, and it's not under your basement floor. So in this situation, I imagine that floor drain is connected to either a drain at the bottom of a stairway, exterior stairway, or it's connected to your downspouts. And so if you're getting water backing up, clear water backing up during big rain events, I would first look and kind of check the downspouts and see if they're connected to the old standpipes adjacent to the house. Because it could be that if you have a sump pump, which you should, or an ejector pump, a grinder pump that's ejecting water out of that basement, then it might not be able to keep up with the amount of water generated and being directed to your basement.
Let's see. A previous owner finished the basement in my house and put spray foam insulation in. Should I be concerned about that? I currently only have water when we have 4 to 5 inches of rain at once. I guess I'm not sure where the spray foam is exactly in the basement. Is the trouble.
Yeah, well, I would just say if the spray foam, for example, is along any cracks in the foundation, it could actually be like an injection epoxy. Sometimes you'll see these kind of bubbles coming out from the wall, and maybe there's a little plastic nipple or dimple connected to it, and that tends to be the remnants of more modern injection epoxy systems that are intended to seal cracks. So it could be a spray foam, it could be an epoxy that's along your foundation. That means just somebody's tried to waterproof your basement before, but I don't know about the other interpretation of that question.
Okay. We need advice on how to stop or divert water from flooding our backyard. We have a sloped yard and it always floods the sidewalk. Yeah, that's hard to, I'm not quite sure I'm picturing that right.
Yeah.
This is the tricky part with these questions, you guys.
Yeah, no,
right?
That's good. So, so in a lot of our bungalows, we have a sidewalk adjacent to one of the along the gangways or sides of the buildings. And as I was saying earlier in the presentation, they will settle over time. And the more water that sits there, the more the water kind of compacts. And sometimes that water pulls the soil into the standpipe, actually, in the cracks in the standpipe, and it just subsides over time. We end up with low points. So you can try to mud jack is one of the terms, but elevate those existing sidewalks to drain away. You generally want to make sure that it's draining towards the back and the front yard. This is probably the trickiest question in addressing water in bungalows is that we don't have a lot of elevation, and it's really not recommended to elevate either your sidewalk or any soil above the top of your foundation. So if you have a concrete foundation and then you have brick, make sure that your yard, including mulch, is at least an inch below the top of the bottom of that brick foundation, because that's a really susceptible place for water to kind of move through your foundation. It's a weak joint. But yeah, generally look for ways to grade the landscape away from your foundation and not towards your neighbors, ideally.
This might be a quick one. We only have time for maybe 2 more if you're willing to do that, Ryan.
Yeah, sure.
How do you know if you have a broken pipe under your home?
I mean, the best way to find that is to televise the sewer. It will look like a broken pipe, or it might look like an obstruction on a camera.
And can you remind who do you call about that, or how do you?
Yeah, a lot of Chicago's residential plumbers will have a camera, a sewer camera, and they tend to run from $150 to $500. They should always be able to show you a video. If they're not showing you a video and then they end up cleaning your sewer, you never know if they really did a good job or if they're telling the truth. I hate to say it, we have a lot of great plumbers and drain layers in our city, and then we have some folks who are not as honest as others. So definitely see the video if you're going to pay for the service.
Great. Interesting one up here too. I've heard that you can close off the incoming water line in the front yard area and keep it from getting into the house that way. But what happens then? Does it put extra pressure somewhere else? Everyone on my street deals with this, and I don't want to be the one who makes it worse for everyone. Thank you, Carolyn, for being so concerned about your neighbors.
This is the most considerate question. Thank you so much for this question. Yeah, I mean, theoretically, yes. If you keep the water out of your basement, then it goes somewhere else. There's an old joke, and it's probably not funny for a lot of people on this webinar, but we have a tunnel and reservoir system that holds a lot of the stormwater in our region, and the joke is that the third reservoir is all of our basements. It's the extra storage capacity for the city sewer system. And part of this is kind of funny, hey, our basements are providing sewer capacity. But this is actually a really important distinction, is that when we built our homes, especially our older homes, they were not necessarily finished spaces. They were not necessarily designed to be lived in an active way. It didn't necessarily have big couches and TVs and things. So our bungalows have adapted, many of our buildings have adapted, and we expect a lot out of our basements. And so in the past, there would be a lot more moisture, a lot more water kind of coming in and out. And now that we're occupying these spaces and expecting a lot of them, we're putting more stress on these spaces. That said, if you install a backflow preventer valve to keep sewage out of your basement, it's probably a very good investment. And it's likely that if your neighbors are also able to do that, it's good for everybody. The water will go somewhere else. Ideally, it doesn't go into your house. Great.
We have some more questions. And they kept coming in as we were answering them. So as I mentioned, in the beginning, unfortunately, we can't get to them all tonight, but we will be sending out a recording of all of this, and several of those questions many of them actually were definitely answered as Ryan was going through the presentation tonight as well. So you'll find your answers in there. They were just submitted before he got around to it. With that, Ryan, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. That was an excellent presentation. And yes, also funny. And yeah, definitely give Ryan a ring if you need him.
Yeah, and I'll look through the questions that weren't answered, and if your email's attached, I'll send you a follow-up note.
Great. We'll copy them all and we can send them to you then.
Great.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for coming tonight. It's lovely to have you virtually, if not in person. So have a good night.
Yeah.